Welcome to More Than Words, a podcast about treating the whole child brought to you by the Reading and Language Learning Center. I'm your host, Tristan, and today I'm joined by outreach specialist Jonathon Wilkins to discuss testing accommodations. Hi, Jonathon. How are you?
I'm doing well, Tristan. How are you?
Fabulous. Thank you. We're excited for you to be here. We're excited to talk about testing accommodations. It's going to be an awesome episode.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So let's start with a little bit of an introduction. Tell us about who you are and what you do.
Of course. Well, as Tristan mentioned, my name's Jonathon Wilkins. I'm the Director of Advising and Outreach at Top Score Education. We're a boutique test prep and academic tutoring company here in the DC metro area, but also have small branches in Durham, North Carolina, Miami, Florida, and of course, like everyone these days, can also support students virtually. Thanks again for having me here today.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's we're excited, like I said, for you to chat about what you guys do. So if people were looking for you guys like online to seek your services, where would they go?
We're on all the traditional social medias, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, the whole wheelhouse. And our website is topscoreedu.com, and we work fully in-home one-on-one. So unlike traditional test prep and tutoring companies, we have no brick and mortar. We're all in-home. So if anyone's looking to work with us, it would be in their house and of course virtually as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. You guys go to them. That's so fun.
We try to tell families we're the most convenient option.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Okay, well, let's hop right into our questions for the day. So, we're talking about all different kinds of testing accommodations. So, what in the world do test accommodations even look like?
Yeah, well, first, I think it's important to talk through what testing accommodations are and what they look like in the real world in a school setting. So testing accommodations refer to the modifications made to the testing environment to better meet the needs of individual students. So not all students will need accommodations, not all students will be eligible for accommodations, but for those students who do need them, it's just a modification to the way that they're learning or the way that material is being presented to them.
Okay.
Students that might be eligible and that might receive accommodations are students with learning differences, or oftentimes students with a physical disability, students with a speech language disorder, as well as some students need accommodations for short-term support. For example, I've had students who have received a concussion through their sport they play or broken an arm, and they just need accommodations for 3 to 6 months.
Right.
While other students who have lifelong learning differences, they might require accommodations through their whole academic career.
Right.
And in terms of what these accommodations look like, it truly varies based off a student's individual disabilities or learning differences. But oftentimes what I've seen in my experience are accommodations like working and completing assignments in small group environments or with a one-on-one setting. I think the one that many people think of these days as the most popular, the most traditional one is time and a half on assessments, meaning that students have 50% more time to complete the work.
Right.
And then you have some students who need assistive technology, or students who need a reader to walk through exams, or some accommodations that go even further become services where you need a dedicated aide. So it's truly an individual process.
Yeah. And so what are the different, are there different kinds of testing that kids can get accommodations for? Is it specific to any one kind of testing?
Yeah, great question. For accommodations, when I'm thinking about testing accommodations versus school-based accommodations, but they go hand in hand, but they can have different processes. So for students in a public school system or a private school system, they'll receive accommodations through their IEP, which is their individualized education plan, or through their 504. So those accommodations are going to be the same that you would get on standardized testing, but those are going to be school-based accommodations. And then in terms of other tests and standardized assessments that students receive accommodations for, the ones that we work with primarily will be students getting accommodations for things like the SAT or the ACT, high school admissions exams like the SSAT and the HSPT. So those are more traditionally the students we see, and that we're working with just as a test prep company. But in terms of accommodations and tests that students can get accommodations for, it truly is any assessment a student is being asked to complete, like those standardized tests that I mentioned. But it also can be the weekly math quiz. It could be the midterm in science.
Right.
It could be extra time completing a paper in English. So if students have accommodations and they're eligible to get them, they should be able to receive those on any type of test or quiz or paper that they're being asked to complete.
Okay, that's pretty impressive because I didn't realize you could get testing accommodations for like the SAT, the ACT, and all of those kinds of things. So thanks for sharing that. Like I said, I really did not realize.
Yeah, of course. And these days what I'm seeing more than anything is we're seeing a lot more test anxiety. So students
Mm,
who, with the additional pressure that's being put in place, especially on schools that are test optional or test blind, it's the idea that the test is going to be, a lot of pressure, which it is. And so
mhm.
what's to help those students who are having that test anxiety or who have had, lifelong ADHD, these accommodations come in and play a key role in their success.
Yeah. And you mentioned test anxiety. So like what are some of the like other reasons that a student might need those accommodations?
Yes, similar to the reason that any student needs those accommodations, it's going to be so unique. I think generally the accommodations for students that I see most frequently are students who have ADHD. They typically need extra time to complete assignments.
Right.
So they'll be eligible for that through their school or through their ed psych documentation. I've also worked with many students who have dyslexia or a speech language disorder
Mm-hmm.
that require a test reader, or even more additional time on exams. So those are really the most common ones. In terms of less frequent reasons student needs accommodations, I've had students with auditory processing disorders that need to work in small group settings because the noise around them from other test takers is too demanding on their mental capacity. So they need to
Wow.
work in those one-on-one or small group settings.
Right.
And then, some other examples would be students with POTS or PANDAS, which are just neurological conditions. They might require testing over multiple days.
Okay. Oh, wow. Yeah, I didn't realize that you could do testing over multiple days. That's great. And so when a parent realizes that their kid might need those testing accommodations, maybe they have the IEP or the 504 plan and they're looking for something bigger, like how do they start that process? How do they go about getting the accommodations their kid needs?
If students are struggling in school because of their learning difference or their disabilities, families should reach out either to the school counselor, a school admin, the student support specialist at school right away. I think the sooner the better that a parent can get involved and really set up meetings about their student in the way they're learning, the better. Families can make these requests also through their primary care physician, which a lot of families don't know. But my daughter, for example, has an IEP, and we were able to get the meeting set up and get the IEP set up through a recommendation through our primary care physician. So
Oh, wow.
there's many avenues you can go through. I think the easiest ones are usually by talking with the school and talking to a counselor. And typically, in order to receive the accommodations that we've been talking through, students will need to go through that IEP or 504 process.
Okay.
And those are public school documentations and public school requirements. If your student is in a independent school or a private school, they'll have their own unique process. And I can't speak to every school, but they'll have, individualized learning plans are what they're typically called. And so that your individual school will have a process, but the process is typically the same. You'll always want to typically reach out to a school counselor. And then in those meetings, once a student is found eligible to have an IEP or a 504 or an LIP, you'll want to start the process and you'll get the documentation. You'll be all set to receive those accommodations, and those will be outlined within those documents. Additionally, parents may also want to reach out to local educational psych testing evaluators, and in that they'll get ed psych documentation, which will also indicate the need for certain accommodations in the classroom or for testing. And then, the line of work that I'm in for standardized testing, it's a little bit different. So
Yeah.
instead of working only with the school, families will also need to work with whichever testing organization that they're using for standardized testing. So for the SAT or for AP testing, that would be through the College Board. For the ACT, that would be through the ACT. And it's a joint effort by parents and the school in that regard. For those types of tests, families will work closely with their school counselor to submit all of the documentation required. And typically that will be submitting the IEP, submitting the 504, or submitting other documentation indicating that they need certain accommodations for these tests.
Okay. Yeah, I was really curious about the SAT and like those standardized testing accommodation requests because like you said, like I've heard about the IEP and the 504 plan process where, you speak with your school counselor and you get the ball rolling in that way. But I was like, I have no idea how in the world you would start the process for some kind of standardized test like the SAT. So interesting to hear that you've got to reach out to the actual like whoever creates and sends out that test. So that is really interesting.
Yeah. And it can be a complex process. And, in a previous career, part of my role was submitting the documentation, and it can
Oh
be,
wow.
both a tedious process and it can be challenging. I've seen many families who receive services in their school that the College Board or the ACT don't always acknowledge. And so
Mm,
persistence is really key in making sure that you have a lot of documentation around why your child needs certain accommodations is really important when you start to look into the SAT or the ACT or other standardized tests.
right. So when is it that you would recommend parents start looking for these accommodations?
Yeah, my answer always is as soon as possible.
Yeah.
If your student has a learning difference or a disability, or even if you believe they do, and it's affecting the way that they're learning, it's affecting their education, you're not seeing the same results that you saw years ago, you should
Mm,
reach out to your school almost immediately and set up meetings to get some answers on how to support your student.
right.
If they're struggling and you're unsure, you want to have the conversation anyways, even if at the end of the day it leads to no IEP, it leads to no 504 plan. It will still help parents get to the root cause of what their student might be struggling with. And
Right.
so at the end of the day, we want what's best for our students. And I've worked with parents who they're a little bit iffy, they're not sure if they want certain labels for their students,
Right.
in terms of this or that, or they're afraid of what it's going to look like to have an IEP or a 504, or to have these accommodations. But it's truly just about making sure our students are getting what they need in the classroom.
Right.
And so that all starts with a conversation. It all starts with a conversation with the counselor, with teachers, with administrators, kind of one team, one dream here.
Yeah.
And so as soon as possible is typically my recommendation.
Okay.
And then with standardized testing, it's a little different, like the SAT and the ACT. For those tests and submitting the accommodations documentation, you typically want to start those conversations 6 months prior to your student taking those tests. So
Okay.
whenever your student is going to take the SAT or the ACT, you'll want to have that conversation 6 months prior. And to when they'll take those tests is a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
But the majority of students will take the PSAT during their sophomore year, usually
Okay.
in October. And
Hmm.
so you'll want to start the conversation typically about 6 months before then, which would be, the June before.
Okay. Okay. Wow. That is, I'm sure, a lot for parents to take in, but also super helpful. I think timelines is something that's really hard to navigate when you just like don't know. So thank you for giving some really good, guardrails there. Appreciate that.
Yeah, of course.
Um, so once we've got the parents have kind of taken initiative and they've got the accommodations for their kiddo and everything's kind of set in place, how do you recommend that the students start to self advocate and remind their teachers that they have those accommodations when it comes to testing or assignments?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
It's a tough question. It's a tough situation for so many students. I think in an ideal world, I'd love to just tell the students to remind their teachers about the accommodations.
Right.
And unfortunately, it's just not that simple in so many schools.
Yeah.
For many students, that type of conversation would be uncomfortable. And after having it, the student still might not see many changes.
Mm,
And it's an important one to have, and it's important that accommodations in the classroom and on testing are being met. The accommodations are make or break for so many students.
right.
And when those accommodations aren't being met, then you're going to have students that develop a sense of failure when they're not making the grades that they want, or they fail
Right.
a test, when if the accommodations were being adhered to, that might not happen.
Mm,
um, and so students should advocate as much as they can, and they should talk to their teachers about it when they know tests and assignments are upcoming. But even more so, what I've seen in my experience is that parents really need to play a crucial role here.
mm,
And for kind of the saying goes, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And so parents really need to be part of the process, part of the solution, and really advocate on behalf of their students.
yeah.
And it's also a grade level question as well, right? My daughter is in pre-K4, and she has an IEP, and she can't advocate for herself in terms of making sure that she's receiving her accommodations or receiving her services.
Right.
And so, parents of younger children will have to truly be, hand in hand with the school, ensuring that these accommodations are being met. And you also have really high achieving high schoolers who can
Mm,
probably own the process themselves.
right.
But again, it's truly oftentimes has to be parent led in terms of how do you advocate, how do you make sure that your students are receiving their accommodations. And parents might be uncomfortable escalating to the school, but it's really important that they do if their
Right.
students not receiving their granted accommodations.
Right. And once you've got those accommodations in place, what have you seen in the students' like academic success and achievement? Have you seen like what in your experience has been the effect?
Oh, it can be absolutely, life changing for so
Yeah.
many students. I've
Oh,
seen students who are just, they hate school. They
right.
have, school avoidance. And it's all because they typically have a learning difference that's not being met.
Right.
And so when those accommodations are put in place, it just allows a student to do their very best work.
Right.
The stress of the school day will lighten. Students will enjoy what they're learning more. Oftentimes it will be a true 180 in how students show up in school.
Wow.
And in that, I want parents to take away from that they should have these conversations early, and they should go for it.
Yeah.
I've worked with students who have had accommodations for nearly a decade at this point. And I've never had a family regret going through the accommodations process, and
Wow.
either, A, getting those accommodations that their student needs, or B, not getting the accommodations, but learning so much more about who their student is academically, and how they can support them at home, and how they
Right.
can better support them at school. But I have never heard any parent regret doing the process, but I've heard so many parents, especially by the point they get to me these days, working in testing accommodations, they get to me in 10th grade. And I hear, I always ask, does your student have accommodations? And they say they don't, but, I should, they probably should. They've had, this diagnosis, and,
Right.
they've needed this support for a decade, but I just never got around to it. And so I always hear regret about not starting the process sooner. And
Yeah.
so if you're a parent out there and you suspect that your child might have a learning difference, or does have a learning difference, but maybe doesn't have accommodations in place, reach out to your school, have the meeting sooner rather than later. And let's make sure that we're supporting as many students as we can earlier on.
Yeah. And that is so like wonderful to hear that you have never heard anyone have regrets about getting their kid accommodations. Like that speaks volumes, you've only ever heard great things.
Yeah. And, for students, I hear, no regrets from families. And then when you see the students finally being met with where they're at and allowing them to achieve their very best, I mean, it just is a whole world of difference for so many students.
Oh, that's amazing. Wow. Well, I think that was my last question for you, but I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to share before we signed off.
I don't think so, but Tristan, this has been really wonderful. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me, and I hope that this has been helpful for a lot of families out there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's going to be super helpful for folks. So thanks again for being here, Jonathan.
Of course, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much to the audience for listening. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a little rating and review. It helps other folks find the podcast, and we'll chat with you next time.